From the Central Western Washington area, Choice Regional Health Network presents the Equity Circle podcast, a place for information with integrity, accountability, and innovation. Enjoy the episode. All right, everyone, welcome to the Equity Circle podcast. Thank you all for being here today. I want to welcome a previous guest back onto the show. So Dr. Mary Biggerstaff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me again.
Of course. I'm glad to have you. So I know there's been a lot of, at times, confusion and misunderstanding about how variants work and really how, even as we kind of talked about before we got started, that's something for me. It's been a learning experience as well, just understanding it, especially as Omicron has come out. And, we've provided information about that in previous podcasts. But I'm wondering if you can just kind of talk about maybe let's start with what a variant is. Why don't we start there?
Yeah, and I think it definitely leads to the question of myself asking, like, my goodness, is this ever going to end? Is there ever going to be a time where we're like, okay, we're getting through this, it's getting better?
Yes,
and
yes.
we haven't really gotten there yet. So so viruses reproduce within human cells, and so as they reproduce, the more and more widespread of viruses, they're just changes, just like there are, changes in all sorts of genetic variations in human beings. And so
Sure.
As of in 2019, the coronavirus, this type of coronavirus was a new virus that had never existed before, and was kind of unleashed out in the world, starting to infect people like crazy. It was very contagious. And as it replicates in different people, new variants of the virus, which are kind of basically structural or genetic variations of the original virus, are created and kind of come to exist. And those start to spread around too. So yeah, I think, does that answer that question, or is that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it does. It does. That helps kind of give a little bit of basic understanding of what a variant is. And so one of the things you kind of alluded to is as you were answering the question, is just talking about, like, is this ever going to end? And I think, we all feel that that frustration and have challenges with that. So I'm curious for you, when it comes to the variants, like, now that we've seen Omicron, like why are more variants coming as vaccinations are being pushed out? Can you help us understand that?
Yeah. So, one, variants are something that are just going to happen naturally. And when you look at a virus that is new and spread throughout the entire world, the more times it has a chance to infect a human being and reproduce in a human's body, the more likely you are to get variants.
Sure.
And so the more people that are infected, the more variants you're going to get. And that's kind of, I think there's a lot of talk about health equity in the fact that we have not gotten vaccines widespread throughout the entire world. US, Europe doing pretty good about getting their populations vaccinated, but
Sure.
We haven't gotten vaccines to Africa, especially Africa is really, really under vaccinated. And so you have a lot of people that are being, COVID is spreading through those populations, and you're going to have more and more chances for new variants to come out.
So it sounds like the issue then is around lack of access and making sure that people have access to the vaccines. Is that part of the reason why some of those variants are starting to come out in different places?
Yes, you're going to have new variants anytime there is an infection. I mean, the flu, there's variants every year of
right.
So there's going to be new variants, but as far as a lot of the variants aren't harmful, or we don't even know that they exist because they don't do anything different. They just kind of, we're not checking it, we're not finding them.
Sure.
But yes, if you let's say magically you got, the Western hemisphere of the world was vaccinated like 90%. You had it very, very well controlled. The COVID vaccination was just endemic. It was just kind of there, but it really wasn't something to be worried about. It was just like other infections.
Sure.
You had like the whole eastern part of the world, or the southern part, however you want to divide it, where hardly only 5% of the population was vaccinated. And so COVID was just spreading like crazy through those populations. You're going to continuously have new variants coming out of coming out of large populations where people are unvaccinated. So, you're not going to get away from like, oh, you're going to control the variants so they never happen, but it's trying to minimize how many variants are coming out, how many people are infected, and how wide the spread is of the variants.
So it sounds like what is following that question, I guess, is is what sort of helps reduce those variants and get it to a place of, you talked about kind of like not necessarily getting rid of it completely, but how do you manage it to be able to control it in a much more sustainable way than what we're living right now?
Yes, exactly. Because I think that that's probably the best that we can hope for, is that we're going to get to a place where it's controlled. Yeah, I mean, a couple things that to control the variants, making sure that we are working to vaccinate everyone in the world at the same rate that we've been able to get vaccinated. So shooting for like 60-70% of the population vaccinated globally is absolutely the number one priority with that. Next thing that does help is something called genomic surveillance, and that is because the variants can be found based on their genetic structure. Um,
Okay.
and that's actually how they found Omicron just right on Thanksgiving, is in South Africa. They were doing a really good job of just testing the genetics of the different viruses coming out to see and watch for new ones coming out. So kind of doing genomic surveillance helps a lot, because then you can very quickly identify variants. And then you can also kind of, the next step after that is, once you've identified like, okay, this new variant, we find out, is it more dangerous? Is it quicker to spread? It doesn't make people sicker. Are the vaccines still working? And then if needed, adjust vaccinations and give people boosters if we have a variant that is resistant to the boosters that we're getting right now. So those are three things that you can kind of do to help control it and move forward as we get new variants.
So based on kind of what you stated there, it sounds like there is a need, at least for boosters, like at least in places where there are higher vaccination rates, is that need for boosters to have additional increased protection and reduce the risk of more variants coming. Was that correct?
Yeah, and so, and it's funny because as soon as I say something, as soon as this airs, it maybe we'll have more information. What I say might not be correct in 2 weeks, but right now it really looks like with Omicron, which I know you just talked about, that boosters from Moderna and Pfizer are really, really necessary to prevent people from getting the infection. That's really, really helpful, and a lot of the other vaccines are not necessarily working, and that you really do want the booster to have your 3 shots total to have the best immunity you possibly can to Omicron. And we don't know for sure. As new variants come out, the vaccines that we have may not work. We don't know.
And so that's just something to keep an eye out. And I think one thing that you said that I wanted to point out is that I should have pointed out at the beginning, we are recording this a few days before Christmas. And as we all know, that like you said, a lot of information can change within a few weeks, and we could definitely know more about Omicron. And so this is set to release in January. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well. So as we've kind of talked about variants and kind of how they work, what sort of hope do you have moving forward as we try to get access to, or get people access to the vaccine in other parts of the world, but also talking about booster shots as well? What sort of hope do you have in the future for vaccines and for hopefully getting it into this pandemic as we all want?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and we talked about this in the last podcast too, like the mRNA vaccine has wonderful technology to be very adaptable, and so that we can adjust very quickly to get the vaccines that we need to people. I'm disappointed that we have not gotten the vaccine spread worldwide, which is really what we need to do, which just needs to be a huge priority of governments everywhere.
Sure.
But I'm very hopeful that that is something that we can absolutely accomplish, and that we can get, the entire global population vaccinated up to 60-70% and get control over, the coronavirus and COVID, so we can do better and hopefully have things somewhat back to the way they were, even if it's not totally normal.
Yeah. Yeah. I think normal is no longer normal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any sense of normal that we wanted before, I don't think is necessarily something that's going to happen. But I agree. I hope that things are able to get to some sense of normal, right? We want to be able to not have to wear a mask and things of that nature as well.
Yeah.
Well, is there any final encouragement or just things that you would like people to understand about variants? I know that unfortunately there's been, as we kind of discussed before we got started doing this podcast, that some of this information about Omicron that's come out and new variants has unfortunately been politicized and has been seen as a a weapon or tool, for those that are quote left wing, to push. So I wonder if you can kind of just help, maybe just clarify why this is more of a human issue, and why we need to get more people vaccinated.
Yeah, and I think that this the variants coming out like they have been and not being really sure what a new variant is going to look like is a very expected normal thing. Very much like 10 years ago, people that worked in public health and epidemiology absolutely knew that sooner or later we were going to have a massive worldwide epidemic of some kind of virus, or a
Sure.
pandemic of a virus. We knew that was going to happen. We know that variants are going to come out. This really isn't any evidence that there is any, biological warfare or anything that people are doing. Pfizer is not in a lab trying to release new variants, so they have to come up with new vaccines. But we do have the technology to do it. And I actually got all of my teenagers were pretty reluctant to get a booster because they didn't want to get the vaccine, but we got everybody boosted up for Christmas time so that we can spend some time with our family.
Wonderful.
So I think it is still really, really worth it to get your booster vaccine. And also that we need to be thinking of this as global, that this is something that we collectively as humanity are having to battle. And it's not about okay, I'm just going to protect my neighborhood or my country or even protect my family. This is something that we have to work on together, and that it's worth looking at this on the global scale. So I think that, just reassuring people that this is something that was very predictable. We don't know exactly what variant's going to come out, but the fact that the virus will adapt and new variants will have to deal with this ongoing is something that we knew was going to happen, and we can see it coming. And so not to be overly discouraged or to think that there's some sign that this is something even more malicious than just a virus trying to kill us.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Biggerstaff, I really do appreciate it. And, I had one final thought that kind of came to my head that I was going to ask you. We talked a lot about variants, and I'm wondering if, what is, for those that maybe aren't aware, what is the guidance for boosters, and when people can get them, just to make sure that, people are getting more protected against new variants that come out?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. So there is some variation if you got one of the vaccines outside of the country, or you got Johnson & Johnson, but particularly with the Moderna and Pfizer, if you are over the age of 16 and you got your vaccines 6 months ago, it is absolutely recommended that you get a booster. It looks like we're needing 3 shots right now, and we don't know. Nobody knows for certain if in the future we're going to need a vaccine every year. But right now, the absolute best protection, and by far much stronger protection you can get, is to make sure you get boosted and get that 3rd vaccine 6 months after you got your first 2.
Awesome. I appreciate that. I just want to make sure that people have that knowledge and understanding, and can make sure to get their booster and make sure to feel safe around the holidays and as we come into the new year. So, Dr. Biggerstaff, again, I really do appreciate your time, and to explain variants and just to kind of help us understand further, so we can hopefully beat this pandemic and kind of come back to some sense of normalcy, as we talked about.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me on.
Of course. Well, we've been listening to Dr. Biggerstaff, who works for Bird's Eye Medical, who have been a very great resource and partner with us as we've done vaccine clinics. I also want to thank you to our listeners for listening to another episode of the Equity Circle podcast. Please share with your friends and family. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season. And lastly, remember that equity equals progress.